Welcome to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum's new Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson. I'm the Events and Programs Assistant at the museum. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thank you to all of those who have joined us in our previous Trolleyology meetings. Over the last few weeks, museum staff and volunteers have been sharing programs featuring Pennsylvania transit history topics that you can experience from the comfort of your home. And today is the last program in this series, but stay tuned for future digital programs. Now, we have some viewers who have visited the museum before, and I see lots of volunteers here in the chat. But for those who might be new to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, we were established in 1954 as the Ardent Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. The museum opened to visitors a few years later in 1963 and is actually located along the route of the trolley line between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. You'll find almost 50 trolleys here, along with some electric railway cars and railroad equipment, and about 20 of our trolleys operate. Around 30,000 visitors per year take the 4-mile scenic ride at the museum. And now I would like to introduce today's presenter, George Gula. George is an operator and a conductor, and he volunteers in the archives. He gives outreach programs. He's been at the museum since 1975, or as George says, a long time. He's also been writing for the member newsletter Trolley Fair since 1977. Today, George will be presenting On the Warpath, Pennsylvania's Trolleys During World War II. George's program does have some text on the screen. If your Zoom controls are covering it up, try moving your mouse or clicking on the screen somewhere. If you have any issues during the show, the chat box will be open and we'll try to help troubleshoot. But George's discussion while he's going over the slides does cover the text that's in the slide as well. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session with our presenter, but the chat box is open and I see you guys are using it. So feel free to enter questions and comments during the show and George will be able to read through them at the end. And again, please keep your microphones muted and your videos turned off during the presentation so that George has all the bandwidth available for the slideshow. George, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad to be back again with all of you. Just let me go through the mechanics of Zoom, and here we are on the Warpath. I was asked to do this. We used to do days at the museum when military reenactors would show up, and one day when our air conditioning was fairly new in the visitor center, they asked me to do something on the trolleys of World War II. And I said, well, originally they ran. But as I discovered, there's a lot of interesting facets about this subject. And so when we look at the credits for a moment, we'll go in. And while, you know, I mentioned to other people that Pennsylvania had its first trolley in 1886 in Scranton, PA, we're really going to start at the height of trolley operation in Pennsylvania. That was about 1918. And this map, you can see, has car lines even up in the north central part of the state, very heavily wooded area, but still car lines connecting everything. Of course, quite a bit here in southwestern and southeastern PA, and then moving up the valleys through Allentown and up into the Scranton area, but even pretty much 60 miles from the New York border, you had trolley service. I think 116 systems and 4,600 miles roughly of track, which is one of the largest mileages of trolley lines in the state. Now, you got to have one of these. I didn't know what to put here. I'm so sorry. So we're going to have to read this, and I'll give you a little bit of time. But, you know, we're looking at the beginning of the First World War. And here's where transit systems really face some of their first problems, because all the wages, the power costs, the operating costs for manpower, and the cost of materials continues to go up. In many cases, it exceeds the revenue. And of course, what person or local government wants to allow a fare increase? That in many cases never happened. And after the war, some other things happened. All three levels of government get involved in road building. We have the introduction of credit in the roaring 20s that allows people to buy a car without saving up the money for it. And so you have good roads, and you have an easier way to produce cars. That Ford mass production really starts to show up. And so there's already Pennsylvania trolley lines being abandoned by 1918. And if you take a look at the stats between 1920 and 30, over half of all the Pennsylvania roads were paved. They had been dirt, now they're paved and they're widened. A car for 1 in every 4 families, about 500,000, were sold in 1920. By the time 1930 shows up, 3 for every 4 families. And I live in Mount Lebanon, so I usually use this. And this is kind of astonishing when I found out from the Mount Lebanon Historical Society that over 500 families in 1930 here in Mount Lebanon owned 2 cars. It's kind of hard to believe, the 2-car families back in 1930. This is Pennsylvania before the wars, very much rural. Lancaster up on the left, Lehigh Valley Transit over on the lower right. But it was very decidedly rural. And these 2-lane roads, you see the trolley on the bottom, paralleling and even crossing the road. Collisions weren't that common during the time of horses, but by the time the automobiles started showing up, collisions are very common out here. And when they start widening roads like the one down on the lower right, you're going to see a lot of trolley lines disappear. So, you know, this is where the car lines, I've got this in twice. No, I went the wrong way. I'm sorry. Wrong finger. Here's Sawmill Run Boulevard. That is Route 51 in the south part of Pittsburgh, for those of you that do live here. This is just an example of one of the government financed roads. Take a look on the top and you'll see what it originally was. Take a look on the bottom. About 1930, it was a county project, and that will be widened again after World War II to 4 lanes. This kind of road starts drawing people out from the city into the suburbs, and of course that takes people away from the streetcar. So here is 1930, about the start of the Great Depression, and as you can see, there's stuff missing in here. There are lines missing in here. There have been cutbacks in Philadelphia, so the trolleys still run in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but some lines have disappeared. And we're going to take a look in another 9 years, and we're going to see, you know, just how much more actually disappears. Okay, this is Mckeesport, and there's that wonderful mill. All of this has been idled until the militarism that begins in the 1930s, both in the Far East and in Europe. So now these plants begin to run again. You know, there's a need for our goods. There's a need for our steel. And so by 1940, I'll read this, $600 million in armaments for foreign goods. That means a lot more people, of course, riding the streetcars. And yet, this is America. This is the America small towns. This is where you sit on the porch. You watch a high school baseball game. You've got picket fences in front of the homes. You know, hand crank phones, ice boxes. They're all very common. This is out near Reading, and it shows the rural road. It shows just how rural much of America still was. You don't see this on the interstate today. Here's Hummelstown, which hasn't really changed very much. Many of these buildings are still here in the square. That's a Hershey car under the arch. The Harrisburg cars used to come in the other way. By now, they're probably going to connect with the bus in this picture. But, you know, this is typical. This was typical small town America. The guy on the bike over here, you know, the SO station, the little phones sitting out there. And America really didn't want a whole lot to do with what was going on in Europe. Our shopping primarily took place in the major downtowns. Washington, PA on the bottom, downtown Pittsburgh on the top. For the trolley lines that still had freight service, you could go to your small general store and order something, which would be shipped from the downtown department stores out to your small community. And you can see the traffic on top and even on the bottom where the trolleys are now battling an awful lot of automobiles. Place where I lived about 2 blocks away in Scranton, because it really shows the typical neighborhood. Not many cars parked in front of any of these houses. they all took the streetcar, or perhaps they took a 20-minute walk to town. I mean, $701 for a DeSoto was a lot of money for a lot of people in those days. Here's Wilkesboro, actually Plains, which is outside of Wilkesboro, and it's just a typical, another typical neighborhood shot. Now, the bottom, of course, you can see the last car in Harrisburg. There was a lot of celebrations as the trolley lines began disappearing in the 1930s. And one of the reasons was buses were becoming much more reliable. And with a bus, you didn't have to start rebuilding the track. You didn't have to rebuild a wire. You didn't need all the guys to do all that work. And you could extend your bus out beyond the end of the car line to get to the newer suburbs. So, you know, we're looking at Duquesne, and that is actually the Dravosburg in Duquesne. It's a very small car line. It's not Pittsburgh Railways. There's the Harrisburg cars. And by the mid-30s, and I've seen documentation, a lot of companies, particularly smaller companies, were really beginning to look at the bus as their salvation, and they began making plans to bus the operation. I kind of love this shot up in Carrick. This was kind of interesting, and I'd seen so many pictures with this, a gas tank in front of a store. I've even seen an optometrist's office with a gas tank in Philadelphia. Anybody could sell gas in those days. The bigger systems were still committed to streetcars, and many systems, in fact, were committed to this new streetcar, a PCC, which was talked about beginning in 1929, and the companies and builders researched this car, developed it, and the very first one of these, after several prototypes, the actual first one came to Pittsburgh in July of 1936. This is the Philadelphia car, which showed up in 1937, or 1938 rather. Johnstown was the very third city, very small city, to get PCC cars. They did not get theirs until 1949. That surprised a lot of people. And the PCCs were faster, more comfortable, and it was hoped they would take people away from their cars. But as you can see in Philadelphia in the upper left and Pittsburgh down at the bottom, that's not to be the case. And so by the eve of World War II, or our entrance into World War II, you can just see how much has disappeared here. You still have lines in here. You're going to see before the war, lines to Elizabethtown, the Harrisburg line, all of York is going to disappear. Up here is all going to disappear from Tarentum up to Sharon. Suburban lines in Altoona will disappear, even though Altoona will stay. And so, you know, quite a bit more is going to disappear before we enter World War II, and everything changes. This is in Philadelphia. That Route 55 car that's hiding behind a building used to go all the way up to Willow Grove, another 10 miles or so up. Now the bus goes up and down to provide additional service during the rush hour. Companies cut back some of these streetcar lines and just ran them on the busier sections. A lot of cars in storage all over the different systems. This happens to be at Southern Car House in Philadelphia. And of course, a lot of people lost their jobs during the war. And so people weren't riding. They didn't go to movies. They didn't go to ball games. They didn't go to amusement parks as well as work. No working from home at that time. And so many of these cars got sidelined. And unfortunately, during the 30s, many of these cars would be scrapped as the storage facilities were closed to save money. Now, 1940. And for those of you that live in Pittsburgh, you might not recognize this at all. Up here where my mouse is in the upper left, you're looking at what is now called the waterfront. During the war, that was a steel mill, and afterwards, before that, you had an awful lot of people living down here in the ward. Almost 20,000 people lived in here. There's the original mill at Homestead, the one that was involved in the steel strike with Frick. And this would all be displaced. Government knew, and some of the companies knew, we were eventually going to get involved in something. This was the mill expansion, which was assisted, the U.S. Steel assisted by the federal government. And of course, this is the fantastic shot that I found of the Arizona going up. This is the second hit with the magazine. There was another hit before that in the rear. We didn't want to get involved in a war, but the Japanese attack in Pearl Harbor brought us in. And all of a sudden, you know, we've got to start converting all of our plants to war production. That's going to create a consumer goods shortage. And people were urged to do victory gardens as an example, and there'd be rationing of a lot of goods. After World War I, because of the problems that the government had in getting us moving, there had been a lot of inquiries and a lot of questions asked us how to do things better if we ever get involved in another war. And so we were much better prepared to get involved. And of course, rubber was one of the big things. You know, there was something called the Office of Defense Transportation that had been created, and then later a division to manage local transit. And they knew they had to do something about people driving or riding buses. They all sat on tires. Tires are made of rubber. This is an actual clipping from a newspaper that I found on eBay. And it's a big reason why, because the Dutch East Indies had been overrun by Japanese troops, and that was about 80% of the rubber in this country. And of course, they're showing you up here what happens by 1944, absolutely no tires for anybody. There were drives for rubber. You could not, for example, have any more than 4 tires and 1 spare. Everything else was given away to including and garden hoses and raincoats, and anything made of rubber was collected for the war effort. Here's the ODT, the local division. Eastman was head of the Office of Defense Transportation. So this is going to get workers to their jobs in local transportation. And this was created as an executive order in December, not very long after the attack in 1941. And so they're going to be able to tell local transportation companies now how to run their system. And one thing they did start to say was, if you have track anywhere that's usable, perhaps you just abandon a trolley line, you're getting rid of the buses. They cut buses away from some areas. They would also divert buses to other areas where there was transportation plants. But all the streetcars, all of a sudden, they had a new lease on life. And they figured that, hey, we have copper and steel shortages too, but hey, we got that stuff in this country. So I drive behind these people today, 35-mile-an-hour speed limit. But back in those days, this was very important. It was called the victory speed. They wanted to know if your trip was necessary. They had gas rationing, and gas rationing was actually put in order to stop you from driving and using up the rubber that we had, and that went in very early in December of 1942. As you'll notice in there, it was in 17 eastern states first, because until they opened up a pipeline, the tankers off the New Jersey coast, South Carolina coast, were being blown up by U-boats. They banned pleasure driving in the east in 1943. There's the national speed limit again in May of 1942. And you had to have a sticker on your windshield that shows you what you could do, what you could buy. Here's a ration card. And I'll let you guys read that. There's different stickers. You don't do anything useful 4 gallons a week. So you're not an employee rather in a war plant. You do get 8 gallons a week with a B sticker, and that's for somebody driving in a war effort. And they did encourage people to ride together. Of course, doctors, mail carriers, ministers, as the war went on, and railroad workers, railroads were very important, got unlimited gas. So did the X sticker. That was politicians of various types. They could get it as much as they want. And truckers, because they're supplying everybody, have a special sticker as well. And here's an unfortunate guy that got caught going to or from a Pittsburgh ball game, and he's arguing his case in a night court. They would go out and find out who was at the games, who was golfing. They would go ahead and arrest you, and then take away your ration card, your gas ration card, or they might just warn you. This is Scranton. You can see there are some cars out. You'll never get rid of them in the pictures, but a lot of pedestrians walking around. Here's the east, and streetcars are coming back. Art Ellis was one of our members. He is, you know, happily lived to 100, and he's still very much alive with us. Art Ellis remembers wanting to take pictures of a West Penn line coming out of Trafford, PA, that was being abandoned. And because of the emergency, he now had to get permission to take these pictures. He had to get it from the Navy Department. I believe he had to go to the FBI as well, because back in those days, it's hard to believe, but a camera was a primary the primary use of camera during wartime, of course, can be espionage. Anybody watching the war movies on TV and Memorial Day, you know, sees that happen. And so you could see the War Department, the Navy Department. They also requested that he send them the film so they can develop it and censor it. And, you know, Art, I guess to this day, is a little upset. He wanted to take a picture of the West Penn crossing the Pennsylvania Railroad and was worried if he shot the bridge, the railroad would show up in the pictures and his film would be censored. Here's the Trafford end of the West Penn line. You can see in the back here and here, Pittsburgh Railways, which met the West Penn there. And all of a sudden, hey, you know what? There's not enough transit vehicles. It's just not possible with the company converting all of their efforts to building war material. Getting transit vehicles, either buses or trolleys, are very hard. And these vehicles become very scarce. And the company starts to scrape the bottom of the barrel, different companies trying to find things. They convert work cars. If they were passenger cars that had been converted to work cars, they're being converted back. And cars like this were also cars like this that were sitting around. And this, it happens to be in Philadelphia, were taken out of storage and, you know, in this case, run over the subway. From the north end of the subway over to 69th Street, where the major subway shops were, so these cars could be reconditioned. That must have really, you know, surprised some people waiting for a subway train when a string of antiquated streetcars comes rolling through. And the work, of course, in the shops increases tremendously. You know, here was 1940, pre-war. You know, we rebuild 3 cars every day. Wow. And this happens to be the interior of a car very similar to one that we have. All of a sudden, the shop is rebuilding 10 cars per week and doing major repairs on at least 16 cars weekly. And of course, all the minor repairs. This is Philadelphia, the Kensington shops up northeast Philadelphia. And companies are going to find themselves short of cars. So Philadelphia Transit, it's a big system out there. Over to the west in Delaware County, the Red Arrow, the Philadelphia Suburban Transit Company. And they had just bought 10 new cars and they got rid of a bunch of stuff. And now they're running short. And they were able to buy 3 of these cars from Philadelphia for the princely sum of $1,500 a piece, I think. And they had took about $15,000 to rehabilitate these cars, and they turned it into this, and they would run until the mid-1950s. They would run well after the war. This is up in Scranton, PA, or Plains area, Wilkes-Barre, crossing another electric line, the Laura line. And this is, of course, a flooding scene some of you might recognize from the last show. But the interesting thing is here is these cars, all flooded and pretty bad, and this snowplow as well, were sold some to San Diego, which was short of equipment, and also some to Ontario, Canada, up in the Sudbury. And additional cars would go down, I'm trying to think where, but West Virginia, I believe. Now, the Ashley line had been, in about 1940, converted to a bus line. And, of course, the ODT, the Office of Defense Transportation, insisted that any line that had track on it that could be used would be reconverted. And they did this. The Ashley line is an example of that. And so it had to be abandoned later after the war, second time. This was the Pennsylvania Railroad that had lost no time in getting rid of the crossing diamonds here in the street. and I'm sure they were very unhappy because they had to put the crossings back in at their expense. I think that was the Jersey Central, not the Pennsy. Now, Scranton, PA, on the other hand, they were building a bridge over the big valley in the middle of town, crossing the Lackawanna River, and the bridge, which I think was begun about 1939, did not include provision for car tracks, and it was about halfway done when all this took place. So the car lines, 6 of them on the west side of town, were all abandoned. Go to Scranton today, and the only building you're going to find is right over on the left, the old Jersey Central Freight House. All the other buildings you see are gone. Okay, the Office of Defense Transportation got involved in rerouting. It wasn't just the companies that rerouted. The ODT, for example, 2 and 20 went down to the Navy Yard, and they insisted that more service went down there, that some lines went farther. Lines were taken away if they didn't think they were necessary. You know, as we said, bus lines were abandoned and not run at all. Other bus lines were extended to new defense plants that were not served by rail. And this is a brochure from Philadelphia. Now, a lot of systems, including the Laurel line seen here, made some money because not every town had the ability to induct and do physicals and swear in the countless draftees that began to show up. The Laurel line was an example. All the people from the Up Valley and area in the Lackawanna Valley, Lackawanna County, Scranton area, went down to Wilkes-Barre to get all of that pre-induction and swearing in the physicals. And so they would make money taking these people down. And they figured about 1,000 men a ride, 1,000 men per month rode those cars. And they figured, and this was primarily a passenger line. So they made money carrying about 50,000. Of course, they would take these people home after the war as well. Accidents were discouraged, but they did happen. And this was a brochure that I dug up on eBay. And they don't want you to do this. Puts a car out of service. It could injure war workers and take them out of the mix too. And so, you know, the shops were moving. The equipment was being fixed, or they tried to fix it 24/7. But they, please don't do that. But yet it did happen. This was in the Mon Valley, and it was an early morning accident where one car ran into another. The newspaper said it was fog, and it was probably also smog, the dirty air created by the burning of bituminous coal in Pittsburgh, you know, coupled with being down in the river valley and certain types of weather conditions caused this. And there were casualties in this. Now, what does this say? Well, you can see the old PCCs here, our first in 36, cars coming in 37, 38. These old cars that had all been built between 1914 and 1927. During the Depression, motors were changed. The motors sit under the car right here on the axles, and the motors were changed out. Faster motors were put in. And the whole idea here was to make the cars run faster, and we keep up faster schedules. We can use fewer cars, and that translates into fewer crew members. But when the PCCs came, it gave Pittsburgh a decided advantage because it didn't matter where they put the old and the new cars. The old ones were fast enough to keep up with the PCCs, which, you know, was not the case in Philadelphia. This is up, anybody want to know where this is? Bigelow Boulevard. So the Hillman Library is now located here where this gas station is. This is the bridge coming out of the Mckeesport area, the 10th Ward, and you'll find, and some of these bridges drastically needed replacement. The weight limits were going down. Streetcars, 12 tons, 20 tons, but you can see steel is needed for other things. Now, trolleys would come out here and take a look here. Here's the trestle, their own trestle, you know, coming off into Dravosburg, and somewhere off behind the sign, they're going to start going up a hill. And so this created some issues because you had to run these heavy trolleys over here, and yet the bridges were weakening. Sometimes they would make temporary repairs. The trolley systems and these interurban systems, in this case the Laurel line, also did not have a high priority for material. In this case here, because the Lehigh Valley, which is over here, had to serve these industries. The Lehigh Valley had the priority. The Lehigh Valley Railroad had a priority, and they could get the track that was needed, and the Laurel Line then put it in. The Laurel Line had a 4,750-foot tunnel, and it took a couple of years of whining and complaining before they started to find that if you didn't get new track in that tunnel, we were going to have a problem. And only then did the government say, okay, you have some priority. And they sent them the ability to buy rail. Air raids. We never had one. But in the beginning, air raids people were worried about them, particularly on the coasts. And they would conduct air raid drills. And when the air raid drill took place, everybody had to get off the car and take cover. And so we have a Philadelphia one up here, and we have the Pittsburgh one down here. And you were issued these tickets so you could get back on the car. It would show you that you paid. The thing was, the operator had to stay with his car. And during a real air raid, he were told to stay with his car unless the bombs got too close. Don't forget there was money on the car. Now, later on, they still run the air raids. Everybody knows it's not going to happen, though. And they didn't even have to leave the car in many cases. Bigelow Boulevard down on the bottom. What we're saying here is that, hey, there were shifts. And when all the shifts let go, the cars were packed. People still had to do regular shopping. And so companies themselves encouraged staggered hours. You know, go downtown, go to the store, but don't go during the rush hour because we need all of our equipment to transport war workers, both going to and coming from the various plants. And a tax goes into effect here in Pennsylvania. And it's 1943, U.S. Revenue Act. And people have to pay it here in Pittsburgh. The tax primarily affected the travel on our trolley lines to Washington and Charleroi and bus trips that, you know, went down to Mckeesport in California and Denora. It didn't really affect most of the local service, but there was a tax involved, and this would be a statewide tax collected. This thing, does that look comfortable? It's a victory seat. It took place in Philadelphia. They took a car and they made these very comfortable seats. And it was like really called a sit-stand seat. That was another word. It was just a piece of plywood with a curve, and you got in a seat, you know, sort of rested yourself, but you were standing. And then you grabbed onto something as the car lurched forward. And that was car 7056, which everybody figured out very quickly that that was not the car they wanted to get on. They all memorized the number. And these are employees, I'm sure, demonstrating that car. And only one was made. And the car was very quickly restored to its former self. This was a way of trying to jam more people into the car. Now, Philadelphia, and I know West Penn, I'm not sure about Pittsburgh, did already have an employee magazine. And, you know, it talked about who was married, who was promoted, who's retiring, you know, who's having babies, that sort of thing. And so the magazine started to be used as a way of selling bonds. They would have these advertisements in here, and they would also have stories as men were drafted and taken away from the company and served in various capacities overseas. You would find out what these men were doing. They, in turn, would find out what was happening to employees who remained with the company. Here's the West Penn articles, just so we know we have at least one local. West Penn was a big system. It not only operated streetcar lines in several cities in both Pennsylvania and in West Virginia, but, you know, it also had power facilities and water facilities as well. Cars began to get painted up. Not every city did this. I've never seen, for example, a patriotic car in Philadelphia. The color shot that you saw in the beginning of the show as a lead-in, here it is 505 in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And 505 now is being restored to service. It survived a lot of bad treatment. It is now being restored up in that Scranton area. But the Lehigh Valley had this beautiful thing here. Johnstown can tell it's 1944. They're looking for more money. And of course, war bonds and stamps were a big deal because wars cost money. We know West Penn had that. We also know, but I have never seen Reading, but Reading was supposed to have had one. But Pittsburgh had about 20. And we're not going to show all 20. But Pittsburgh wound up painting, all the cars that showed up in 1942 in patriotic ads, for women, ads for bonds, war drives of various types. Some of them were very colorful. There, Route 22 was a line that ran right through downtown over to the north side, and both were very dense business areas, and more people probably saw the cars on the Route 22 than anywhere else. So they assigned them to Route 22. In fact, in later years, all the advertising cars would be assigned. That's Allegheny General Hospital in the background, and this asks for women to join the Marines. Women's Army Corps, the wax, very colorful car here. And again, at the terminus, this was a great place to take pictures because the cars sat there for a while. They didn't move. And 28th Division, I do not have a color car for that. This was a National Guard unit. Very early on, it was taken into the United States Army. It saw fierce fighting, heavy casualties. They participated in the Battle of the Bulge and were the first unit actually entered Germany. And here, I thought this was kind of interesting, the women's nationality groups all getting together. Now, if you grew up in Scranton like I did, it was kind of an Archie Bunker neighborhood. Everybody was living in their own neighborhoods. My grandparents and some of my parents, the ethnic groups fought each other. And they brought all this, I'm sure, from the old country. And it is changing, of course, now. But if it happened in Pittsburgh, this was a very interesting way to show people that all of these ethnic fights that were brought over, in former times, they were being put aside. We have one thing to do, and that is to win the war. And we're all working together to do that, buy bonds. And of course, women were going to be used at some point to operate the streetcars. The manpower shortages were tremendous as the draft went on. And don't forget, there's a lot of other war industries out there too, some paying much more than $1.10 an hour. And so the ads show up here in Pittsburgh about 1943 or 4, I believe 44. Here's Philadelphia, which hires their women operators first in 1943. And I was told anyway, by one or two people here, so I'm sure it was true in Philadelphia, that as their men were called off to war, they went in to help take their men's place. And there were special buses sometimes going in the neighborhood so they could sign up without going downtown. The ads were put out. Philadelphia, which had their own printing facility, printed a lot of this stuff. And about 10%, I think, of the workers were taking, the war workers, requiring the women. And so all of this is being put out. And, I don't expect you to read all little type, but, from will you be my motor woman to lady, we need your help, get out here now. All of these different ads are out here, and many do volunteer. And many in Philadelphia, transit company will stay on after the war. Anybody doesn't know Molly Pitcher, I'm sure they don't teach that in history. And Molly Pitcher was a woman who was supposed to have been with her husband at the Battle of Monmouth, very, very hot battle, hot day out there. And after her husband, who was serving at a cannon crew, was either killed or wounded, she took the husband's place. That's what we know. And of course, Philadelphia being a very historical city, they began calling their motorettes or their women operators the Molly Pitchers of PTC. And a lot of printed material was put out. There's the bus for, women's to just walk out into their neighborhood and sign up. And of course, it's a wonderful job kind of thing. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't change it for the world. And, nobody talks about the long hours that I'm sure were necessary. But they were trailblazers in this respect. No women that I know of operated streetcars during World War I, although some systems considered it. We weren't in that war long enough. And so, and then they get enough, and now, the ads change. And the ads continue to say, look how important it is to have these women operators here in public transit. And that's just another one here. They were also looking for men, of course, and they would have to get an older man beyond draft age, probably beyond 40, who wants to do this kind of work. And there they are. Here's Pittsburgh. They begin their training in 1944. And here up on the right, Mildred Hal Co was Pittsburgh's first woman operator. There's a few more over here. And I remember talking to an operator who's now dead, and was doing a show on the Mckeesport trolleys, and she had worked the Mckeesport lines, and she told me that here in Pittsburgh, they were called, the women operators were called trolley dollies. So that was near, not Molly Pitchers, but trolley dollies, and they were trained, here's Philadelphia, and the women had to be trained just like the men, how to work the switches, how to, get your poles pulled down. I'm not sure if they were taught how to climb the cars with these uniforms to get on the roof if a rope broke. These are pictures I got out of, there were Xeroxes, and I guess I did a pretty good job doing them. Here's the Red Arrow, Delaware County. Women operators here at their cars. That's Ardmore down at the lower right. They got instruction, and they were put to work, well, regularly uniformed. And also in the shops. Now, this picture happens to show them cleaning up. I don't know, what they wound up doing in the shops. Certainly, you had to be very skilled mechanics, so I'm sure they wouldn't do that right away. But I'm sure some of them, got to work underneath the cars on the mechanics of the cars. But after you painted them, they do have to be polished and lacquered before they can go out. And without enough men, they probably were assigned to do that. They had their own area of the car house. Newspaper, Philadelphia Record took a lot of pictures, and they brightened it up in the corner. Over on the other side, the men probably had their ping pong table, their card games, and whatnot. But here's where I got the title on the Warpath. Magazines would show these new trolleys that would show up during the war, when they did show up, as victory vehicles, and they were trying to show just how important it was, to have these cars, and how important the running of these cars were to furthering the war effort. And Philadelphia in the bottom is talking about 2 million passengers a month just for 657 streetcars. And here are some of the scenes that you might see during the war. This is the Homestead Mill, which actually covered 4 communities. People, probably getting on during a shift change. Here's Neville Island. That's the island in the Ohio River north of Pittsburgh, and it's still fairly heavy with industry. It was loaded with industry back in those days. Dravot, for example, was out there making landing craft. Then there was a steel mill. I think Shenango Steel was out. There's still a chemical plant out there. And the Route 23 cars ran through there. They also ran special cars from different areas of the city. The operators would take their cars over. People would load up. They'd pick nobody else up. And I remember talking to one operator once that told me about all the shenanigans that went on in the car after these guys had done a 12-hour shift. And he was told by his managers, just look straight, get them home. West Penn, south of here, they reopened closed Coke Works down in the West Penn area of Westmoreland and Fayette counties. And so West Penn Railways got a new lease on life as the Coke Works began starting up. This is Mount Braddock, a typical West Penn operation with passing sightings. Johnstown, take a look at the sign up on the right. They're looking for people. And Johnstown, of course, had Bethlehem Steel. And they had coal mines as well, so they were transporting people everywhere. Reading, you're hard to believe, Reading. But they made aircraft parts with a special copper alloy. They had a lot of garment industry here in Reading. And there are just 2 shots here in Reading. Now, Lancaster, which of course is sitting in the middle of an agricultural region. And they make belladonna, which I've been told could be a poison if you use it right. But it's also for emergency drugs. They used it in surgery. And they also used it as an anesthetic and as a paralyzing agent. Here is the countryside where the Hershey Transit ran. And we all know, of course, watching the war movies, Hershey made chocolate bars. They also made D-ration bars, which were food for the troops that could be easily carried. As well, you could take people from this area, and by transferring people, you could get them to Lancaster, or you can get them to Harrisburg. And of course, Bethlehem Steel, the Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton area. Huge industry, a huge mill at that time that was served by the Lehigh Valley Transit. Mack Truck was always in Allentown as well. And they were, of course, making military vehicles as well. And the Lehigh Valley Transit would also get people, if you had to go to Philadelphia to work, they would get you down, as well as the Reading Railroad. This is both of them passing each other at Hatfield. Here's the red arrow. Beyond the Lanark Car House, of course, on Westchester Pike, and their ridership just went up 50% in 1 year, 1941 to 1942, and doubled again between 41 and 43. You know, imagine a transit system carrying 41.7 million. And yet this little system did it. Philadelphia by far had a ton of industries. Here's the shipyards. They had 7 or 8 of them on the Delaware River. And they were all working, and they were, I think, on both sides. And they were fixing damaged ships and building new ones. And this, I think, was Cramps, the gang on Delaware Avenue at Cramps Shipyard. Over at the Budd plant, where other war material and was being produced, as well as other transit vehicles. So you could see 2054 in the corner. 2054, I believe, was reconditioned in Philadelphia in its original silver colors, I think back in the 80s. 2054 survives today in Scranton, Pennsylvania. ECTMA owns an Electric City Trolley Museum. And some routes were created specially. Some of these cars we saw earlier that were being rebuilt, they had originally had couplers, and some of those couplers were reinstalled. And the routes, these routes, the slash route was a special route. In this case, it went from the Quartermaster Depot to the Navy Yard. And they were specially created to haul tons of people to places where they needed to go. So they weren't regularly scheduled routes. Coal. Coal is very important. The Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area would produce that coal. That's a huge coal breaker up here, which would size the coal for your ovens, as well as for the sizes of industry that needed it. Here's the Laurel Line, Prospect Viaduct here, another electric line that actually had Pittsburgh connections in building. Look at the old bus here. Look at the stuff they had to resurrect that was sitting in the scrapyard. And everything ran 24/7, and you couldn't just do regular maintenance. All they were doing was pretty much, band-aiding these cars and sending them out. So you're wearing these cars out. And here's one other shot out here. Look at the safety zone. I hope nobody's driving down the street here, but the cars are just packed. This is over at the Frankfort Arsenal, which made all kinds of military gear. And, not only women, but black workers made very tremendous strides here. Many coming out from the South to take the war jobs. There was a labor shortage, of course, up here. And the federal government had gotten involved that banned companies making war materials from being race specific. They wouldn't certify a union unless they allowed minority participation. But that wasn't true for mass transit. And Philadelphia here in Pennsylvania was an extremely racist area. Now, you could talk about the upcoming events in a whole program, and we don't have that time. Suffice it to say, there are all kinds of things going on here, not only the company's racism, but a fight between two unions. And, they wanted to, as you can see, we are fighting it. We're already drafted, and we're fighting. Why can't we drive trolleys? Operating a trolley, being a conductor on a trolley was a very prestigious job, paid very well. and company wasn't hiring blacks to participate in this work. And so you have the union fight, as you can see down there, and the union, the old company union that was thrown out by the transit workers union, the new union, began to make this an issue. And the company makes it an issue by saying, well, we really haven't signed the contract. The workers have just voted to put the TWU in. The federal government, however, doesn't want to listen to this. And, you know, they're basically saying the War Manpower Commission, you know, says PTC has to abide by, you know, our employment policies. And that forbids any type of discrimination. And so they respond, the company responds by promoting 8 black workers, or the term back in those days might have been colored or Negro workers. That's a term that was used in the 40s. And they begin training. And they're going to turn in on August 1st. What will happen is they will begin to run a car with the mentoring of a senior operator, as he's, you know, after they've learned to actually just run the car. They're now going to run it on the street. They're going to do everything an operator should do, and they're going to be mentored by a veteran. Company union doesn't like it, and they actually threaten to go on strike, and they do. August 1st, the motormen turn in. The union goes out, and at first they really say nothing about what this is. Later, it's going to come out that they're really against the newer employees, these new black employees from working. And of course, it idles everything, just totally idles everything. And they're all calling off sick. That's what they do at first. And that's going to change later on. And the real reasons are going to come out. And they, as you can see, what they said, and that's a quote from the newspaper. I didn't make it up. That's what they wanted to do. There's all sorts of problems. You know, Philadelphia is known as workshop to the world. It's got a ton of major and minor industries all devoted to war production. And about 70 or 80% of the workers all of a sudden can't get to work. Unless the military, the Navy did this, had their own buses to get people to the Navy Yard, you know, you're fending for yourself. And these pictures all show, you know, for some reason, no guys, but all beautiful young ladies, you know, hitching a ride somewhere, trying to get to work. And they use anything, any means. All kinds of trucks are used wherever they could to get people to work. Sure, not very comfortable, but they're trying. They're trying to get to work. They're trying to do their part for the war effort. This was one I found from the newspaper, an ice cream truck in the early morning hours, taking people to work while the guy is delivering his Dolly Madison ice cream, very common ice cream in Philadelphia. And of course, that's the, you know, that's of course the ultimate photo shoot for people trying to get to work. But that wasn't going very well, and nothing would happen. So by August 5th, no negotiations happening, and Roosevelt, you know, actually one of Roosevelt's officials, one of Roosevelt's assistant, you know, signs the order that the Army is going to take over, and they assign Major General Philip Hayes, and they bring in 5,000 men that are destined to really go to Normandy. And don't forget, June 1st, D-Day, yeah, and 2 months later, we're still fighting to try to get out of the hedgerows and away from the beaches. It's still a very bloody situation out there. And here they are diverting troops to take over. And of course, the notice is put up so everybody knows, they seize it, control. The newspapers have this signed up. And the city's very happy because there had been sporadic issues in various neighborhoods. People were worried. There had been riots in Detroit over a similar issue, not by a transit company, but in industry. And the people were happy because now the troops were going to be here to protect them. And Hayes originally goes in to negotiate with the union leaders, and you know, tells them we need to get the bullets out. You know, finally he's just exasperated, and it's August 5th. And he just says, look, here's what's going to happen. You guys show up for work tomorrow. And if you don't show up for work, that next day, you're going to be in the military. Anybody who's draftable is going to be drafted. And he says, you're going to be trained in California and you're going to the Pacific, which of course of the two theaters was by far the worst. If you're too old to be drafted, you're going to be banned from work in any of the war plants, which is where all the money is at that point in time. And of course, he's got his 5,000 men, and they symbolically take down all the flags at the car houses and raise their own. And I always thought this is kind of neat. You know, there's another shot I've also seen of angry union leaders and other supporters. You got to be very patriotic, and the flag's going up. It's the Army flag, but it's going up. But the Army means business. And you can see them here at Luzerne Car House taking a look at everything. The troops are moving on to get on the cars. That's a Browning automatic rifle. They've set it up, and never had to use it, of course, but I'm sure it, you know, it scared some people. They did have fixed bayonets at times on the cars, and they rode the cars, 2 or 3 men on each car, to prevent anybody from stopping the cars moving. That young lady is the first operator to take a car out, streetcar, and she will later be ostracized by the union, and she will quit. The Jeeps were out in force along the car lines to make sure there wasn't any trouble. And this was newspaper. I found this on eBay. This is kind of cool. And don't forget, back then, every young guy had a rifle. And there he put on his tin pot, and he is going to assist the troops on the car. His sister's taking him for somewhere, I guess. But that's 10th and Luzerne down by the car house. So. And another one I had picked up was this one. And many people were out there giving lunches to the troops. So here he is smoking his cigarette on a car, and but the young woman is providing food and more than one lunch bag. So I guess she's doing that to a number of the soldiers on the route. And as we said, there was the harassment stopped, all the rioting stopped, or whatever was going on stopped, because troops really meant business, and they would stay for about 6 weeks before turning the company over. Or returning it back to the company. This is gas rationing, huh? In 44? No, there wasn't any. By that time, there was plenty of gas, and the automobiles were outnumbering the streetcars here in West Philadelphia and on Lehigh Avenue. So people were driving to work, and you know, even though we had quite a few shortages, it seemed to be easier to get around in your automobile. No new ones had been produced since early 1942, so that's why you see all these old black ones. And then victory in Europe Day, and but of course that's not the end of the war. The Pacific War is going to rage for about another 6 months before it ends, and everybody, in this case Philadelphia, is happy as heck. Beer is flowing in South Philadelphia, as you can see, and this is going to bring the problems back. The next day, all the restrictions are voided by Congress, and the trolley companies are going to have to fight for their life. And here are the returning veterans. And I found this somewhere. Philadelphia did have a plan. I don't know if Pittsburgh did, but Philadelphia developed a plan to reintegrate the war veterans back into the company. And the ads on the cars in Pittsburgh, which would seem to paint things everywhere, all through the 50s and 60s, now centered on hiring veterans, certainly hiring and helping handicapped veterans. Remember, many war veterans are going to come back with very severe wounds. They still have to get back in and work. In Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, the women are allowed to stay. And I remember actually talking to a few when I began work in transit here in Pittsburgh in 1975. We still had at least 3 who had begun their career during the war. Companies like the Red Arrow would dismiss the women as the men returned. And of course, you can see all the old bus routes will start to come back. There are no more restrictions. This is up in Pittsburgh in Oakland, around Bigelow Boulevard. And these people are all going to college. I don't know if any of you ever wore a suit to your class, but I often wonder, were there any young men in this picture who may have been a veteran who's now taking advantage of the GI Bill? They did provide some ridership for the transit companies as veterans, other veterans came back and relicensed their vehicles that had been in storage and began driving again. This is about 1947. And Philadelphia, about the same time. Baltimore Avenue, the horses are still out, as you could see. The traffic is back. People are driving, they're not riding the trolleys. They are, however, blocking the trolleys. This is the Mckeesport shot. I know some of you have seen the accident photo. You wonder, why am I using it again? Because I think it's a great photo. And the new cars are coming out, as you can see. And the problem is the new cars are wider and the streets are not. And so it becomes just one big battleground all over America, certainly all over Pennsylvania, where the streetcars still remain. The other thing that's going to happen now are legitimate strikes. They couldn't strike during the war, and they were promptly put down. But now it's 1946, 47. Nobody's been really paid any additional wages since 1942. And in fact, some of the perks that we argue about today, healthcare, they were all instituted as a way of providing workers with something, since they could not get a pay increase. And transit, like any other worker, is going into these strike modes. And you'll have strikes through the 40s and through the 50s into the 60s. Certainly a number of them here in Pittsburgh, right up until the creation of the transit authorities. There's some new cars that show up. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Johnstown. Ridership stays up for several years, 3 years or so. And the companies are encouraged by that. And so in Philadelphia, they buy new cars and they get some secondhand cars from systems that are out of state that are getting rid of them. Pittsburgh also buys new cars, and even little Johnstown buys about 18 cars. But everybody else is buying one of this car. The new stuff is out beginning in 49, and they're going to continue to advertise in the magazines. And of course, you now have this National City Lines, which has always been in the business of buying up little trolley lines. Now they're going to buy up some of the bigger ones. And in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia is one of them. And they're going to start getting rid of streetcar lines. In fact, one year they replaced trolleys with 300 buses. This is Pittsburgh, whose systems are shrinking. It was part of a big utility holding company. It's going to be freed of that in 1950. It's going to have no cash, however, because a family named the Guggenheims was able to buy up the stock of Pittsburgh Railways very cheaply. And in this fight to break up the company, they got away with all the cash. This sign on Liberty Avenue used to blow smoke. And this little thing covers steps going down to an underground public restroom. There are a number of them here in downtown Pittsburgh. I know the slide's it's like that. It's a little blurry, but it's a great shot. It shows the worn out equipment, both bus and rail, here in Lancaster. And welcome home to our heroes. It's all worn out. And as I said before, many of these systems had plans to busify. They were going to convert as quickly as they could. Now they go back onto that plan, and as soon as they can find buses, as soon as they find the money to buy the buses, this is what's going to happen to the remaining streetcar lines, beginning in 1946 with Fairmount Park. Hershey goes away in 46, Lancaster 47, Wilkes-Barre in 50s, the Lehigh Valley services in 51 and 53. Reading goes away in 52, and that's only one remaining line that had a franchise issue. Our own West Penn out here is all gone in 52. There's the Laura line in Scranton going away in the 50s. Altoona also in 54. Altoona and Scranton, by the way, were owned by the same company. Johnstown will finally get rid of all of their trolleys in 1960. And here is a little bit of that, and I'll show you my pointer. Here's Allentown, the rail and the bus. This is West Penn. Down here is Wilkes-Barre, which really replaced a lot of their trolleys, not with the buses, but this is a trackless trolley. See the double overhead? It's an electric bus with electric motors in the bus, and it makes it a very quiet, very efficient bus. And because there's a lot of coal mining up here, they have access to a lot of cheap power. Here's Altoona here, and similar car to Scranton 505, which is now being restored in Scranton. And in fact, there's the automobile stores showing up. You want to be a do-it-yourselfer and buy parts, you can do that. Look at those brand new cars and that ancient Scranton streetcar. That'll all be gone by 1954. I showed this because there's that 4,750 foot or so tunnel that the Laura line built in 1905. You can still ride through that today. on a streetcar. Freight service also runs through, and the electric passenger service is going to disappear in 1952. The electric freight in the middle of 1953. There's 401, the very first electric freight locomotive built here in America by Baldwin Westinghouse. And that's what's going to happen to many of the old cars. Some bodies are going to be bought for homes, for sheds. And in fact, one of these Wilkesboro cars has actually been removed from a house and is now undergoing restoration. That was originally an East Penn traction car from Pottsville. Here's Johnstown, which is really, your typical small downtown. Somebody with a bike out here, for example, and your phones here and all these small stores. There's an A&P back here. These were not big stores back in those days with huge parking lots. And I've got a picture somewhere with a giant eagle that kind of looks like that. Now, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh are going to keep their trolleys. They're going to keep them through the 60s and through the 70s, and we're going to have the energy crisis. And of course, all of a sudden, America is going to rediscover electric streetcar transportation. In the meantime, Philly and Pittsburgh have cars that are pretty badly banged up and graffiti all over them. But the transit authorities, when they get a hold of this, in Pittsburgh, our primary modes of transportation were bus and streetcar. And they made it a point to get rid of a lot of the streetcar lines. They couldn't get rid of all of them because some of them were on their own private right-of-way. We had the Mount Washington Transit Tunnel. But in Philadelphia, they had such a problem merging railroads and bus lines and streetcar lines and subway lines. And there was so much deterioration. The major mass transit lines had to be taken care of first. By the time they were going after the streetcars, the energy crisis showed up. So we still have 6 lines today in Philadelphia and 2 lines here in Pittsburgh, shown by the one in Philadelphia in the upper left and down lower right, Pittsburgh, that are still running. They're light rail lines. And that could be another story for another day. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And we can try to answer questions, or you can make comments, or please tell me if I've made any mistakes. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, George. If you have any questions for George, or comments, as he says, you can type them into the chat box now. We are using our chat box for questions today. And before we wrap up, I wanted to mention some of our other upcoming programs. We will host a virtual version of the Western Pennsylvania Trolley Meet next week. We will have a series of programs over the 2-day event, including repeats of a few Trolleyology presentations. So if you were curious about George's When Bad Things Happen to Good Trolleys that he mentioned, we will be showing that again, along with the ones that are on your screen now. We'll also have some interactive sessions, such as a Share Your Slides Nostalgia Night and a Trolley Museum Community Zoom, where more than a dozen of the trolley museums around the region will be sharing some updates from their staff and volunteers. So we've got some very exciting things to look forward to, and you can actually sign up for these now on our website. So just go to our homepage, patrolley.org. You'll be able to see those under the West Penn Trolley Meet link. They are free, but Zoom has a viewer limit. So sign up early if you'd like a spot. And again, thank you guys so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed the program, please help us continue sharing them by making a donation at patrolley.org/support. And you can support us in other ways too. At the link, you'll see how you can become a member or a volunteer. And George, you're getting lots of nice comments, so that's great. And I am going to share the link to those Western Pennsylvania Trolley Meet programs in the chat right now. So if anyone is interested, you can click on the link directly in the chat right there.
Yeah, Kristen?
Yes.
Can you hear me? There, a gentleman, Ed Kohler, and I did not know this. I thought this was 1942, that funny movie. He said California and Oregon had air raids, and Oregon was bombed. I didn't know that at all. It did not happen here in Pennsylvania, which was the title of this particular show. But, for the benefit of everybody, I did not know that there was something happening in Oregon.
Great. Well, thank you, Edward. And thank you for the other comments. And if you have any other questions, You can enter them now. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for joining us for Trolleyology today. This was the last one of our first edition, our first series, if you will. And thank you, George, so much for sharing. And thanks to all of the volunteers at the museum and staff who have shared their presentations over the past few weeks. And thank you to those of you who have sent us emails and replied to the survey we sent out. Again, the links to our upcoming talks are posted on our website, and we hope you can join us for some of those next week. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your week.